Antonia Hylton is a Peabody and two-time Emmy Award-winning correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. As a student at Harvard, she was recognized for her investigative research on race, mass incarceration, and the history of psychiatry. She's a former correspondent and producer for Vice Media and currently co-host of the hit podcast Southlake and Grapevine. From education to immigration, politics, special reports, and breaking news, her investigative reporting has brought to light complex and challenging issues. And her drive for truth has led her down the path of creating her New York Times bestselling book, Madness: Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. In it, she tells the 93-year-old history of Crownsville Hospital, one of the last segregated asylums with surviving records and a campus that still stands in Anne Arundel County. This incredible story blends intimate tales of patients and employees, research and archival documents, and her own family's experience with mental illness. Now, after her presentation, we will have a short Q&A with questions from all of you. So on your tables are some notepads and cards. If you have a question that arises during her talk, please write it down clearly, nice big letters, and hold it up. A member of our team will come and collect it, and we will get to as many questions as we can. So let's get started with our day 2. Please help me in very warmly welcoming to our virtual stage, Antonia Hylton.
Hi, everyone. I hope that you can hear and see me. I am so honored to be able to join all of you today. And my only regret is that I'm not able to be there in Maryland celebrating with everyone in person. It has meant so much to me to be a part of this community, to get to know so many people in the area over the last 10, 11 years of doing this work. I want to present to you some of my work and much of the argument of the story of madness. But I will try to be as concise as possible out of respect for the fact that I know people in the audience will have questions, that this is a team of folks who have lived and worked in this space and lived these issues. And I want to make sure that I give you the time to talk to me or to ask me the questions and curiosities that you have. In March of 1911, officials in Maryland marched 12 Black men into the heart of the woods in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. Those men were allegedly suffering with a range of mental illnesses and developmental differences. But when they entered the forest, they did not find a ward or a therapy room or a place to rest. There stood a doctor named Robert Winterrode, and he told these patients that they had a new job. They would spend the next 3 seasons doing the backbreaking work of building an asylum, clearing roads, moving railways, constructing a foundation, erecting a series of massive brick structures. And then when they finished, they would step into the rooms, into the wards and the hallways that their hands built, that they hammered into place. And the doors would close behind them. And they would become this institution's very first patients. It's an unbelievable story, but it's also a very American story, one that I've spent the last 10 years unearthing. It's the history of Crownsville Hospital, once called Maryland's Hospital for the Negro Insane. It's a story, a case study really, that tells us so much about the foundations of our mental health care system and about our beliefs about patients of color. More than anything, I think its birth represents a critical moment, actually, when many of the myths and the pseudoscience that had filled this field in the years after emancipation were actually cemented and calcified into a practice, a system. You see, Crownsville was created by the Maryland General Assembly after years of debate, not just in Maryland, actually, but around the United States. And this debate was about what to do about Black people who seemed to be so unwell, so unstable in the years after slavery. Doctors, politicians, members of the media at places like the Baltimore Sun and Washington Post, they all commented, wrote, and shared debate about what they observed to be an increase of insanity among free populations of Black members of Maryland, of America. Many of them bought into this myth that I mentioned, this myth that Black people were uniquely incapable of handling the rigors of everyday life, uniquely incapable of being free, that we were inferior and we required different and substandard care. So places like Crownsville were built up all around the United States in the 19th and 20th century, purposefully separating Black patients from white patients. And some of them, like Crownsville, sought to recreate and reenact at times the antebellum social order. What I show in Madness through records and oral history is that this myth, this origin story told to us about healthcare, about these patients, impacted the hospital all the way up until its closing in 2004. It led lawmakers, for example, to provide less funding, to invest less in therapy, and ultimately to make Crownsville a more carceral rather than therapeutic space. It led reporters who didn't have deep ties to Black communities in Maryland to write sensational, racialized stories about the institution that further eroded the hospital's reputation and capacity for good quality care. And these actions aren't just hurtful and discriminatory. They didn't just impact the Black patients at Crownsville and the Black staff who came to work there in the mid-20th century. These attitudes, these myths, these stories about who we are and the kind of care that we deserve, they had long-lasting impacts on the asylum from its founding as an entirely white-run institution, even to the moment that a Black superintendent took over and tried, but often struggled, to overcome all these challenges. I firmly believe that building a better future in mental health care, or honestly in the healthcare field more broadly, is only going to be possible if we understand, value, and talk publicly about our history. I wrote this book because in my experience as a reporter traveling the country and as the family member of a patient, a loved one who is struggling with all of this, I believe that doctors, nurses, and therapists and social workers often aren't properly equipped to provide these services to people of color. And that's an injustice. And I think that it is in no small part because they often don't appreciate the legacy of race in mental health, and they don't understand the context, the community we come from. I experienced this firsthand. As I wrote in part of my book, my own loved one experienced psychosis starting in 2020. They believed that a group of white supremacists were hunting them down. They would tape up all their windows. During the summer, they went without air conditioning. During the winter, they went without heat because they believed that this group was hunting them and planning to kill them with a toxic gas. It was terrifying. My family fought and fought to find a provider in the state of Massachusetts, a state that we were told had some of the best mental health care services in the country. We could not find a single doctor of color. And the doctor that we did find ultimately repeatedly told my loved one that they weren't as interested in discussing race, that they didn't see their fears about racism and racial violence in America as relevant to their diagnosis or their care. Mind you, this is the time right after George Floyd's murder, the moment of racial reckoning. This was leading up into the January 6th insurrection at our nation's capital, a moment when many Black Americans, many Americans, I think of actually all backgrounds, were suffering deeply. And still we couldn't seem to find a doctor who thought that that was relevant to the kind of medical care my loved one would receive. It was horrifying, and it made my loved one lose faith and disconnect from therapy and refuse treatment. But it also motivated me, frankly, to see parallels between my loved one's experience today and the stories I discovered of patients in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s at Crownsville. I think that it is now on all of us to use our different types of platforms in the media as advocates, storytellers with lived experience, or healthcare providers. We have to actively fight and debunk the individual and collective myths that have been told about Black patients and our shared history. For those who design and run these programs, my ask to you is that you think about reimagining the ways in which you deliver care and build relationships with your patients. I ask that you remain open to learning more about your patient's humanity. And that means at times being open to the fact that you may sometimes get it wrong, For advocates, it means seeking local leaders and politicians who believe that mental health matters, who are willing not to just support a single clinic or put up some money for a project in their own backyard. We need the kind of leaders who want to think big about investing in good schools, good parks, safe social spaces for children, and affordable housing. I don't need to tell you all of this, but all of these systems are tied together. You do the work. You know, a great shiny new hospital isn't much help if your patients go home to poor housing and they don't make a living wage and they don't have good healthcare coverage. For me, in the media, it means we have a responsibility to tell these stories, to debunk lies and falsehoods publicly, repeatedly. It also means elevating the stories of patients and providers who are doing all of the good, all so that we can help destigmatize these issues and bring more people into the fold, into this movement with us. Thank you all so much for hosting me here today. It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to answer your questions about my work and about madness.
Antonia, thank you so much. It is great to see you again. And we've got some questions from the audience that we are going to pass your way. Again, a reminder to everybody, there are index cards on the table. Please write your question. Staff will pick them up and bring them up to me. So first question is, in trauma-informed care, we ask, what happened to you, instead of what's wrong with you? In your research, how did people talk about healing from the trauma of enslavement and institutionalization?
That's a great question. What I found interesting in my research, and perhaps this won't be as surprising to many of you, was that this idea of trauma-informed care really wasn't present until pretty late in the 20th century. Many of the people who may even be in this room right now, and certainly who live and are still very actively working in these spaces in Maryland, they were some of the pioneers of this work. And I write about some of them in the book as well. Prior to, say, the 1980s, when a lot of these Black doctors, psychiatrists, Black nurses got into the institution and were able to start talking to patients with a different level of cultural context and empathy, prior to all of that, for decades at a place like Crownsville, people were simply not asking those questions. And this is not just something that we know through oral history and from families who say they didn't receive great care and some of those personal level allegations. We actually know this from looking into the historical record preserved at the Maryland State Archives. So we can see that doctors didn't keep notes about Black patients' histories. They didn't ask them those kinds of intake questions. They would do some basic physical examinations, note if the person had a physical disability. They would sometimes actually not even provide any kind of clear diagnosis at all. There were patients at times at Crownsville for decades who didn't have a firm diagnosis and who were not regularly receiving any type of treatment, especially before any sort of medication. And many of the professional standards that we'd all be familiar with now were set closer to the 50s and 60s. And so trauma-informed care is something that developed much later. And it became something that at Crownsville was really spearheaded by Black providers who I think, of course, received training at places like the University of Maryland, but in many cases instinctually knew to do this, to ask those questions, because they came from the very same neighborhoods that their patients came from. And it's one of the reasons why this concept of community care and being taken care of by people who know you, who look like you and feel like you, not just at a sort of skin deep level, but a really historical and communal level, can be so important, and why so many people in these spaces are, of course, advocating for more of this, because those doctors come into these rooms, these conversations, and they often ask better questions. And we saw, at one point, a doctor who I write about at one point in the book named Dr. Brian Sims, who worked on trauma-informed care in the 80s at Crownsville. He was able to institute a program that actually brought the recidivism rate down for patients who were being court committed and court observed at Crownsville. And he was able to do this because he personally drove to their homes. He had personal contact with their family. He was making sure they were staying connected and on their medication schedule. And that when they dismantled that program, the state of Maryland started to discourage providers at Crownsville from doing that. They saw those rates go right back up. And so, it has been known for a while now, certainly decades, how valuable this is. But in many ways, it was some of these pioneers who were outsiders in their field, who were getting some of these first jobs in a space that was very new and fresh to desegregation. They were building a lot of these practices up for the very first time. And there are many parts of this country, as you heard from my lived experience, where people still aren't doing that. And the argument I make in this book is that if you're not asking those questions to patients about their family history, where they come from, what they've experienced, who they are and how they are doing and how they see themselves in the world, that you're really not providing much healthcare to them at all.
Thank you. Here's another question from an audience member. How do we encourage more Black professionals and advocates to get involved when mistrust is justifiably present?
I asked a lot of the experts in my book about this very question. And I think there's a few levers, there's a few ways to go about this issue. One that many believe would be effective would be to create programs and mentorship opportunities in these very competitive medical schools that support researchers, doctors, nurses of color, so they can get through these programs and feel seen and heard with the different challenges that they face while they try to get through them. Many Black doctors have left the field describing very hostile environments. So addressing those environmental needs, the support, the friendships they can build, having trusted advisors that they can reach out to, that's one immediate way that we can think about these things. The other is making sure that these jobs pay well, that there are good opportunities for those providers and their families to live in the communities that they serve, so that they are not, say, commuting from far distances to come into the city in which they need to work, so that they're not so far from their patients that they actually really don't know that much about the neighborhoods that their patients live and come from. And so making sure, I mean, this is why I said that mental health is everything. It is good schools. It is affordable housing. It is a living wage. And it means pushing the leaders who are supposed to be accountable to us on all of those fronts, because all of these things are not just good for the patients, but they actually mean that we have the best providers possible able to come to work at these spaces every day. And I think that the other piece is that these medical schools need to think a bit more deeply about what cultural contextual training looks like, what empathy actually means. And I think that sometimes the training that these doctors, from the folks I've spoken to in my reporting, that they receive, it can be very surface level. It doesn't certainly have the full historical context. And my hope is that my book and other books like it, and hearing more from people with lived experience while people are going through that training, will create an environment in which they're then able to go out into the field and use that knowledge and to incorporate it into the ways in which they interact with people on a day-to-day basis. So I think it is attacking it really from every side, from the cultural side to the training and environment and the culture of medical schools and these programs in the first place. And then on the back end, how do we make sure that they and their families feel they can live and they can work here and they're supported while they do so?
Has there been any talk about using your book in any of the schools as part of the curriculum?
I have received notice from several schools actually that are starting to integrate madness into the curriculum, from Morgan State to, yes, thank you. It's very exciting, and it's really an honor, especially as a first-time author, and to feel, this is a space that I think there have been people talking about it for a long time, but it can feel very new to others. And so to see schools in Maryland, but also around the country, I've heard from people at Vanderbilt, Harvard University, who want to integrate this, actually not just into medical schools, but also at the undergraduate level as well, for students who are just interested in pursuing biology, and interested in chemistry, interested in the history of science. That there's a recognition that for far too long we've been talking about the heroes and the contributors and the patients in those spaces from a pretty Eurocentric perspective. And so I've heard already from educators that they're starting to use this book to push back against that, and to add some texture. I even heard from one professor in Tennessee who's planning to build an entire course around this book. And so I'm really excited to see that all continue, and I'll be keeping my eye on it as the fall gets closer.
It's wonderful, wonderful. What has been the overall reaction to the book?
It has been overwhelmingly positive. I receive emails still every day from readers, from doctors who are excited about the work, who tell me that they see themselves or the story of a family member in the book. I've heard from people with connections to Crownsville who tell me that if I write a second book, or a documentary is made in the future, that they're now ready to speak about their experience there, that the book has helped them process some of their own memories. And I think I was at times fearful bringing this book out into the world, because we're now in this moment of backlash, of course. There's an anti-DEI movement around the United States. Books like mine are being banned in schools. And there's a push to talk a lot less about the legacy of race in our country, and in the foundations of our systems. And so I think I was afraid some people would not want to have this conversation with me, or that this book would come out into the world and there would be crickets. But it has been the exact opposite, which to me is really heartening. It tells me that the folks who think that they're pushing these movements, and that they represent what the majority of Americans want to hear or talk about right now, that they are not right. And that there is an appetite for this work. There is a community here. I think that the book and its the way that it is spread globally, even now, it's been being published in the UK. It is being translated into Polish right now. I think that says a lot, that there are people across an ocean who are seeing their own stories, or bits and pieces of their healthcare system in ours, and they want to make change. That's everything that I could have asked for. And so I have been blown away by the response.
Oh, that is wonderful. I don't know if you can tell from a virtual perspective there, but the feeling in the room is, oh my gosh, you have everyone's rapt attention. And I wish you could feel that and be here to get the sense of what folks here are feeling and thinking.
Thank you.
We have another question. We know that people of color are overdiagnosed with psychosis, schizophrenia. What can we do to make sure that people are seen authentically and without stigma?
I think some of this is connected to what I said about the training and the support necessary for the providers who are going to interact with these patients, because that's who we depend on. My family has depended on them. And it was a fight, and it was an unfair fight, to feel like we thought we were going to walk into emergency rooms or clinics, and someone would immediately be empathetic and understand the pain that my family was going through, and do everything they could to support my loved one. Instead, we felt that my loved one was isolated in these spaces, that they were the only patient of color at times, that it made it harder for them to be heard. And it then made it hard for them to trust and to get onto a path to care and to find the right diagnosis and medication. And so what my family really had to do in the interim, in this moment at which people are talking more about mental health, but the money and the services and the support haven't really met the moment yet, was that we had to fill the gap with a lot of communal support. Thankfully, I come from a very big family. I'm one of 7 kids. I have 30-something cousins. So we kind of had shifts of support where people were coming to visit this person consistently. We were calling their doctors and making sure that they knew this was a family that had their back and was going to be paying attention to what happened. And so if you find yourself in a place where you know there's someone who needs that extra support, being that person, it's not the solution to our structural issue. And I would never argue that it's on us individually to fix a societal problem. But in the interim, where we're just not there yet, our politicians aren't, there's no new Community Mental Health Act, and our politicians aren't bringing forth a grand countrywide solution. We do need to step up and be those people who make those phone calls, who attend those meetings, who help our loved ones, who visit the group homes in which they live, who come to see them in inpatient facilities, because that's kind of the only way that we have accountability at the moment, while we still fight for all those other things at the same time. And it always sort of pains me to give that answer, because I think we are in this strange moment where so often patients are receiving a message that they are that they should download an app on their phone, that they should, they can now get virtual medication dispensed to them, on a website. They can go meditate in a corner, and that these are the solutions available to all of us. And it should be easier than ever to get good care, when the truth is that that's not the truth. And these individual responses don't recognize that a lot of the health outcomes that we're seeing are because of a collective failure. And so it pains me sometimes to give that answer about how to be the loved one to people in your own life, how to step up for others in the moment, because it feels like I'm telling people to take on that individual responsibility. But the reality I see, or that I felt while living this with my family, was that you have to kind of do both at the same time. Push for that structural change while also figuring out on an interpersonal level how to keep showing up for others, how to be the person who volunteers, who makes the call, because otherwise there are a lot of people who are going to be lost in the moment in the process.
Thank you. I know you're on a tight time schedule, but if you can you do one more question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. What was the most surprising part to you of writing this book, and what was the most hopeful part of writing this book?
So the second question is easier to answer than the first, because there were a lot of surprises. The most hopeful part of this book for me is the easy one. So it is the community of mental health care providers, nurses, doctors, former patients at Crownsville, the people who helped Crownsville survive, who did what they could day in and day out to make this a place of rehabilitation and humanity. And I think a few of them might be in the room, T and Barbara Arthur, for example. These are the people who honestly very often move me to tears, who lifted me back up when I was very down. Living the experience my family was living while writing a book of this nature could be really hard at times. But knowing that there were people like them out in the world who loved their patients, who cared, who wanted to innovate new programs, who wanted to bring music and dance into patients' lives at a place like Crownsville, the knowledge that people like that are out there, and that they did this work most of the time just from the goodness of their own heart, and not because the state of Maryland was compensating them particularly well and celebrating them and rewarding them constantly for what it was they were doing, that those people exist. That was the saving grace for me. And it just reminded me that there are always the people, the good, the helpers, the innovators out there, even in a moment like this moment when things can feel quite bleak. So to me, this is a book that's about the history of this hospital, but it's also a love letter to those people. The elements of the work that surprised me, there were times when I was very surprised just by the letters, the records left behind by some of the early leaders of a place like Crownsville, just how openly bigoted they could be toward the patients they were supposed to care for and serve. That surprised me at times. I knew I would find some of that. I was shocked at times by the extent. In one chapter, I look at the transcript of a conversation between the former leader of the mental health care system in Maryland and a Black reporter in the 1940s. And just the way in which he very directly tells her that he doesn't believe Black people are capable of providing good care to their own community. The way in which he says he really doesn't see desegregation as a priority. And he doesn't seem to see the connection between the poor care being administered at Crownsville and his own refusal to actually open the doors to a community of people who were desperate to get in there, to get jobs and to help. That was really, the discovery of that transcript was shocking for me, because he kind of lays it all out there. And it was tough to process. There were these moments where I'd find records like that and I would have to take a break for a few weeks from the work. And then I was surprised at times by stories like the Elkton Three, three civil rights protesters committed to Crownsville in the 60s after trying to eat at a white-only restaurant, labeled by the courts in the state as insane for trying to do so and for trying to protest their treatment. And so, you know, I think one of the things that surprised me about that was not so much that it had actually happened, but that so few people knew about it, that the Elkton Three isn't something that's taught in our schools. It's not part of our civil rights education in this country. I think that the relationship between psychiatry and the way that it was sometimes weaponized against Black Americans, or really all Americans in that period, where so many were pushing for change and reform. I think that that's something that should be more better integrated into our core curriculum. And it's something that I wish I hadn't just learned as a college student, but actually had learned back, in high school. And I think these are things that certainly in Maryland, students should know and have more relationship with. And I think it's a shame that it's taken a while for these stories to get to the forefront.
Absolutely. I know we're at time, but are there any final words you'd like to leave us with as a room full of people with lived experience, family members, people who work in behavioral health? What thought do you want to leave us with?
I think the first thought is actually a thank you for what you do, a thank you for building community, for coming together at a time when I think so many of the forces and pressures on our world can make what we do and what we talk about feel impossible and so far away. So thank you is actually my first thought. The second piece is that I think that the sort of flip side of the coin that I talked about, this idea that we're in this weird moment where companies are trying to sell us these individualized products and they're trying to push the responsibility of taking care of our mental health just on us back at home and in our bedrooms and our living rooms. The flip side of that is that I think that it's, as much as it's a reflection of the fact that they don't respect what we need and what we do and what we care about, it actually is a sign that there is a growing community of people in this country looking for something, desiring change and reform, asking for help. More Americans than ever coming out of this pandemic are trying to access this kind of care. And so the flip side of that, the pressure and the pain and the worry that's associated with all that, is that there are more people than ever who might be looking to come into the room that you're in right now to help you, to push for the same legislation that you might be interested in, to hold accountable the local leaders who you think have failed. So how do we take advantage of this moment? How do we find those people, destigmatize these conversations so they feel comfortable talking about their lived experience too? I am finding more and more as a reporter covering different parts and corners of the country for NBC, that no matter what story I cover, mental health is always at the end of the day, the story. It is at the foundation of the story. And some Americans, they haven't found the language, they can't describe it exactly in that way, but it's sort of what they're trying to tell me all the time. When I talk to struggling teachers, when I cover an education story, when I talk to people worried about crime in their communities, when I talk to people who are worried about books being banned from their local library and what it means, and when they wonder why their neighbors are doing this to them. So often, a lot of the culture warring and the pain and the division in our country actually comes down to a deep-seated need for a different type of support and help. And that means to me that there's a different kind of movement we could build here, that there are a lot more people we could bring in together into these rooms, and that we could push for something, we could, for once in this country, actually get our lawmakers to look at us as a constituency that matters, that they have to respond to, that they owe something to, because that's how change in this country unfortunately happens. You need to get those people to care about you and to see you in numbers. And I think we're kind of at the precipice of that. We just need to figure out, how do we get all those folks to recognize that they're with us too.
Wow. Thank you so much, Antonia, for spending the time with us this morning. Oh my gosh.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for everything that you do, for caring about these communities, for having the strength and resolve to speak up. It makes the work of reporters like me, it makes our lives so much richer, easier, and it makes us feel like these stories matter. You keep us going. And so I'm grateful to be part of this, even if it's virtually today. And I hope that this is just the beginning, and that many of you reach out to me and you keep me posted on stories that you'd like to see me and people like me cover in the future. This is an important part of our national story, and I'm in it for the long haul. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone.